So, hello, Riaan. How are you today?
Yeah, I'm good. How about you?
Well, it's going well, actually. Thanks for asking. I have to thank you for taking the time to be here and talk to me about the beautiful subject of budget, which I know it's everybody's favorite. And without further ado, I would love to ask you to introduce yourself a little bit more for the audience and myself. Actually, I want to know a little bit more about you and your background, if you would. That would be great.
Gee, yeah, I'm 46 years old, so it's quite a long background. Um,
Well, that's
but
awesome.
assuming that you want to just learn the summary, I'm originally from South Africa. There, I grew up, went to school, studied there, majored in finance, and then eventually we started to traveling the world. We now live in the States. When I came over to the States, I worked for Ernst Young and their finance team for a little while. Then joined the Netflix after that, where I was for about 11 years.
Wow.
Yeah, so my specialization has been mostly in finance and finance systems.
Very cool. So Netflix is a very, very familiar name. We all, most of people know what Netflix is because we all watch it. Like I watch it every night, every day. So that's very cool to have a person from Netflix talking to me. Personally, I'm very thrilled. Um,
Right, with no company.
so budget and what you just described as experience, you are pretty seasoned with that. But we are talking to people who are not. I am only familiar with budget since about 7 years ago when I got involved in operations, and it was tough for me. I didn't like it because every new idea, every awesome idea that I wanted to bring on the table, and then there was this budget thing that was like, oh, that's a great idea, but hey, we have a tight budget. And now I want to ask you, Riaan, why do we have this annoying thing for a lot of us as budget, even in a household, right? Like I'm a woman, I would love to go out and shop. I would love to just be, whatever. I don't want any limitations. But what is the budget, and why do we define a budget for any organization, even our house, even us?
Well, I think in an ideal world, we'll have unlimited resources and we wouldn't have to plan ahead.
Right.
And we could just go and spend our resources wherever we can. But the reality is that's not true. So a budget really represents kind of the income and expenses that you're going to have within a given period, and makes you think about how should I best spend those resources over that period. You typically get budgets that are income and expenses focused, and then you get cash flow budgets as well, because those sometimes are very different from a timing perspective for businesses.
Correct. So that's the reality, and we all are going to respect that with budget, because there's nowhere that you can work or be as a functional being that doesn't follow a budget. Now, who does set a budget for a company or organization, and who is involved in decision making when it comes to budget?
I'd say it's typically your finance teams that are driving the budgeting process, but they work with various people throughout the organizations. Typically, the people that are in close contact with operations and to really go out and spend the money, or people that are involved in. If you take an organization that's dependent on funding, as an example, you have people that go out and actually raise the funding. So finance teams will work with the relevant teams that drive the funding to understand kind of what's going to be the timing of the funding coming in, how much will the dollar values be, who's going to be your main donors. So the finance team really works with a lot of the rest of the organization to get a good understanding of what the budget should be.
Right. And once it's set and it's approved, then how you communicate that with the rest of the team, and what do you expect from
I
them?
think I think for a budget to be successful, you need to actually work with the team constantly, and so constantly make them aware of what the budget's going to be. Otherwise, if you're a finance person, you just come up with your own budget of what you think it should be, and somebody else doesn't agree with it. It might not be a fairly accurate budget. So I think it's this constant communication until you get to a stage where like everybody's kind of happy with what the final numbers are, and then they all can kind of stick to that budget.
Correct. And by everybody, we have a team of probably management and finance that have their final say on it, and then you deliver it to whoever needs to know what the budget of the year is, and they have to manage their own departments based on that. Correct?
Yes, yeah, but not all organizations run off budgets. There are some smaller organizations where strict budget is sometimes impractical. Sometimes your business is not very predictable, and you come up with a budget, but it's really just giving you a guideline as to how you should spend your money. At Netflix, we didn't really have a strict budget. It was more of a rolling forecast.
Right.
And the teams would understand kind of what they should be spending throughout the period. Right. But there was still kind of that understanding of where the resources should be spent.
Correct.
And the word budget is very, very broad.
It is very broad, and you just touched on a very, very great point. That was my next question was about monitoring the budget. So let's say the budget is set, it's communicated. Should we just leave it until the next time when we're asked to do a budget, or should we really monitor it? And how do you suggest to monitor a budget from a small organization to a giant like Netflix?
Yeah, I think if you don't spend time monitoring your budget, you might as well not prepare a budget, because it'll be a big waste of time.
Right.
I do think you should monitor the budget. Typically, the monitoring is comparing your budget to the actuals that are coming in,
right,
and then understanding any variances that may occur, understanding the reasons for those variances. Sometimes they're timing related. For example, if we're expecting funds to come in from a donor in March, but those funds actually only came in April, the exact same amount, then there just would be a timing difference. But if you were expecting $1 million to come in from a donor and only 500,000 come in, that would be an actual dollar value difference. Right. And so it's important to understand the reason for those differences and what's driving it, so that you can then go and adjust your spend for the rest of the period. Usually, finance organizations do closes on a monthly basis, where they do monthly management accounts, and then they would compare that to kind of the budget, and on a monthly basis go and adjust kind of what they think their actual forecasted spend is going to be for the year.
That is exactly what I think happens in any organization, more or less. But now the question for follow-up is, you probably have faced sudden changes to budget in the middle of a fiscal year, for many different reasons. And now in pandemic, it's really easy to say sudden changes because we just are in one of them. How do teams of finance and higher management should be prepared to face those sudden changes, and what usually is a good security to have? Is it like good planning? Would you plan ahead for surprises? Would you have extra money in the bank for surprises? How are different organizations of different sizes face this?
I think if we all had a crystal ball where we could plan for these surprises, it would be a lot easier. But the reality is that you can't plan for these surprises.
Right.
You just have to react to them as kind of they incur, especially in the pandemic stage. I'd say the constant monitoring of the budget and then comparing it to where you think things are going to be based on how circumstances have changed is fairly important. I think the typical approach would be to have a look at how circumstances have changed, and then assess whether it's worthwhile kind of reassessing your budget or readjusting it based on the facts as of a given time. That's why coming up with your initial plan or budget is a good idea, but you should really throughout the period assess whether it still makes sense to spend your resources on the given areas.
Right. And,
That makes
typically
sense.
it does make sense. And typically when you say monitoring, you don't monitor it every day. Like you don't sit by your program and monitor it every single minute. What do we mean by monitoring? Like what's the intervals?
No, yeah, I mean it's just based on circumstances and how they've changed. So when the pandemic started, people would have looked at that and said, okay, well, how is this going to impact us? And then estimate how that would impact the budget and then go and adjust as needed. If you look at like a company like Zoom, where now all of a sudden people are using their services, you'd expect their revenue to kind of increase. So they'd probably say, okay, well, we can have more revenue there, therefore we'll have more income coming in, and therefore we can probably go and spend more. If you're somebody that is dependent on funding, you might say, well, I'm not sure if that funding is going to come in. Let's speak to donors and understand whether they'll still donate and what that donation value would be, and then go and reassess. So yes, it's not something that happens on a day-to-day basis, but there are people that are kind of that understand what the budget is and kind of understand what they need in order to manage the spend towards that budget, and then go and assess whether that's still accurate or not. And then if it's not, they'll communicate to the finance teams and say, hey, we need to adjust or reassess things.
Correct. That's really good point. What one thing I want to share with you is that now, like with our organization, when pandemic hit, like we are solely dependent on traveling. So our organization is an organization that takes volunteers to international communities to serve. And as you know, you've been one of our volunteers. It's all about traveling. So then, when the pandemic hit, the first thing that was suspended was traveling, and then we see how small organization or small businesses are now surviving based on some surplus of their budget, something that they have planned in,
Yeah.
or accidentally it happened to that they had something to some savings to live and survive by, or they planned for it. So that tells a lot of small organizations or even big organizations to do not always run on a tight budget. Some managers actually are proud of doing that. Like we work on a very tight budget. We always have a very tiny budget to work with. I mean, it's great, but doesn't always work for survival. So that's a great thing to look at now after, if the middle of COVID, to look at your expenses and see how it plays with all of the things that you want to save and survive, and then probably plan ahead a little bit for the next budget to come. What do you think?
Yeah, I would say that included in your budgets, estimate these events come and go, and so you don't know when the next one is going to happen.
Right.
But you potentially, as an organization, you have a good idea of the previous event that occurred and what happened as a result. So potentially, you had to let a few people go because you couldn't really afford to pay them anymore.
Right.
And so it's good to actually incorporate some sort of a surplus into your budget, so that you could actually plan for those future events, so that when the event occurs, and the next one is going to occur again at some point, then you've at least got some sort of a surplus that you could actually apply towards those costs. And then for those years, you might trade in a deficit for a little while, until that that you've got available or had available, that reserve, is fully depleted. But that gives you at least some sort of a bucket that you could use,
Right.
In difficult situations.
Right. Even with governments helping, it's a period that you have to wait for those funds to come in. So even for that period, you need to have something, cannot completely run on dry. So that's a very good wake up call, actually. Now, Riaan, for somebody that has worked with a lot of big budgets or you know very detailed per se budgets, um, what is the beast software that you work with, or does it have to be a big giant software that you purchase for a lot of dollars? Or what do you suggest? Like, for example, myself, I started using Excel for budget. Now I'm using Google Sheets, and that works pretty fine for me. What do you have in mind for to tell like our partners of a good program or software to use for budget?
Yeah, I'd say that you're like probably 80 or 90% of people out there doing budgets. Majority of them use spreadsheet type applications. Excel and Google Sheets are definitely good ones to have.
Mm-hmm.
I think if you're in a situation where you have to collaborate with a lot of people globally and there's many people giving input, then sometimes it could be quite difficult if you don't have the right tools.
Right.
But for small organizations, I think Excel and Google Sheets are great applications to do your budgeting, and you don't really need much more than that. There is an element of manual consolidation potentially, but again, it depends on the size of the organization. You could go all the way from having fancy applications that cost you quite a lot of money to just using basic spreadsheets, which is my preference.
Mine too. Do you have any tips per se for Google Sheet or anything like where people can go and learn more about it? Do they have to take courses and get certified for it, or is it something that you can self-teach? Or I mean, I would love to know myself because I'm a user. I want to know if there is something that
Yeah.
I'm not looking at. Yeah.
I think it's a little bit of a loaded question because it depends on the person. Some people learn easily and are very resourceful.
Mm-hmm.
There's so many resources out there at the moment that you can just go to Google and YouTube and you can go and find anything about these applications. So that'd be a good starting point. And then you've got certain companies that focused on education and learning over the internet, and those could be the next companies that you focus on. But if you go and Google Excel or Google spreadsheet tips, there's so many courses out there that'll help you. A good starting point would be to be specific about what you want to search on these applications. So if you want to search, for example, how to prepare a budget, Google Sheet actually shows you specifically how to do that.
Correct. So I think first you need to basically have like a basic idea about using spreadsheets, and get comfortable with using spreadsheets, and then apply your knowledge into budget planning. Is that what you're pointing out? Because I think
the only way that you become the only way you become comfortable with something is by doing it quite frequently or a lot. And so a good way to practice is actually going and searching on a given topic and then just doing it with the person.
Mm-hmm.
And then hopefully you're exposed to opportunities where you could actually do it within your role or in your job, where you get a lot of practice. And then as you get experience, you pick up more tips as you go. The important thing is to always challenge how things are done, and always realize there's most likely an easier way to do something. And so if you're taking over somebody else's budget, instead of just taking it over and populating numbers, rather understand what's happening and then research if there's easier ways to do it. And Google and YouTube is a great resource for that.
So the other thing that I wanted to touch base on, probably one of the last two topics or questions, is that do you like doing budget, or is this something that you just got comfortable with? Pardon me?
It depends. Yeah, it depends on the person. Some people like to plan ahead.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't say I particularly love the task of preparing a budget, but I like to plan ahead and understand where I'm heading. Similar to people just setting future goals and trying to achieve those goals. I think preparing a budget and living within your means is a very important thing. So yeah, I wouldn't say I love the task of preparing a budget, but I understand the importance of it.
That's a very good point. It's not per se an enjoyable thing that you can jump and enjoy is doing that, but
Yeah.
it's necessary. Like a good plan for getting to a summit of a mountain. You need a plan to look to see when and where you're going, which is great. That's a great point. The last question I have is a little rather a personal question for you, and it's: do you apply all of those knowledge at your personal life, profession? Do you monitor your life spendings very tightly?
I wouldn't say very tightly, because I think it depends on the number of resources you have available and how flexible you are in spending those resources. I do track kind of at a higher level at least what we spend on as a family, but it's not like we say, okay, you've got $100 for food and you've got $100 for,
Right.
traveling or whatever the case may be. Um, for me, it's more about understanding what we've spent it on in the past and then kind of managing that aspect of it.
Right.
So I don't prepare a budget. I don't prepare a budget and stick towards that. Although I would recommend that for a lot of people. But no, personally, I don't. Personally, I track more what we've spent it on.
Correct. Okay. It's good to know. Riaan, are you back? Okay, now I
Yeah, no,
have you.
sorry, you were breaking up there.
And actually, I thought you were frozen.
Did you get that?
I got
Yeah,
the
yeah.
answer. The answer
Did I
is
say
here.
anything or not?
Pardon me?
You got the answer, okay.
I got
Yeah,
the answer.
you
Yeah.
got the answer.
Don't worry, I caught these parts. The other thing that on the last question, it's not about budget. It's about Riaan
Okay.
and family during pandemic. How do you guys spend your days? And what has been good about being all together in pandemic?
Well, I spend my day preparing budgets and then looking at budgets.
No, you're not.
No, I'm only kidding. Um, I have, there's so many things to do around the house, so I spend a lot of time on doing things within in the house. We take the kids out. They still need to do their sports, even though the sports are not available at the moment. So we go and practice with them. We go cycling every now and then.
Very cool.
Yeah, but that's about it.
Okay, that's good. I mean, just we are happy that the warm days of summer are here, so there are more options to go out and have a little bit of fresh air, which is great. And Riaan, the reason for this kind of chat wasn't to teach anybody how to do budget. As you know, like we can't really do that because everybody knows their nature of their own kingdom or their own organization.
Yeah.
It was just, knowing what a Netflix type of person, a person that is in charge of big budgets, how can they speak about budget? And we all speak the same language, to be honest. Budget for everybody is the same. Same thing. It's just a matter of a little bit more details, or maybe tight monitoring, or a little bit less tight monitoring. But it's all the same thing, and we all need to have it and need to respect it. And it helps in normal days and in not such normal days as pandemic. Budgets are always something you can go back and you see how you plan for your road ahead, which was part of the reason why we had this conversation. And I think I got a lot of great answers from you.
No, I would agree that the purpose of this is not to learn about budgeting or learn anything new, because there are people that are way more experienced than me when it comes to budgeting. I wasn't really in charge of budgeting at Netflix. I was involved in some of the processes, and so I understood kind of how sort of the budgeting there worked. But there are resources online that are a lot better and easier to learn from. And I do think it's an important topic to go and learn and pick up.
Correct. And thank you so much, Riaan, for your time. And this is very valuable. And, as a great member of our volunteers, we rely on you guys to help us with when it comes to these kind of topics, because we have skill-based volunteers for a reason. And thank you so much for your time. And I hope that you have a beautiful summer with your family, and hope to see you actually physically soon in a great program.
Cool. Yeah, we'll see when this is all over.
It will be over one day. I'm pretty sure. Have a fantastic day, my friend, and stay healthy with your family. Bye bye. Thank you.